All right, we'll start recording. And so today's session is for OAuth Basics. We're going to be going through a lot of different things. I had a little bit of fun creating a little word cloud. There's lots of words there. They'll eventually make sense. There's a lot to OAuth that we'll be talking about. And what I thought we would do for today's session is we'll start to lay the foundation. Next week, we're going to do a little bit more about how you manage OAuth, and then we'll start some of the flows, and then we'll finish the flows the third week. If we go faster than that, that would be great. But I think that might be a good pace for us to layer on the knowledge and make everything work. When you first look at it, it all is very jumbled, like the word cloud. But the more that I study it, just layer by layer, it helps a lot to do it that way. And anytime you have questions or comments, just like always, feel free to stop me, and then we'll go through it. So OAuth, what is it? It is open authorization, which is different from authentication. If you remember from our single sign-on sessions, they're very different. So the open OAuth is a protocol and a framework. It's going to enable different parties to have access to protected resources. So your data in Salesforce would be considered protected data, and it's a great example to look at it that way. So where is it used? So there's a lot of different kinds of applications that use it. You guys are used to using desktop applications, web, mobile, but also your TV, your Roku. Those are devices that are using some sort of, hopefully, OAuth. And at the very end, I'll show you an example. I traveled recently, and I had a great example. I'm like, oh, look, I can see OAuth in action here. So I'll give you those examples at the end. It might require the end user to authenticate to that application to allow access to the resources. So you might, anytime you've used Data Loader or Workbench, and it asks you to log in with your Salesforce credentials, the first time you do it, it asks you to grant access to particular resources. That's exactly what OAuth is, and that's the interaction that you're seeing. You go to Workbench, and you log into your Salesforce org, request access, and then you grant that access. So questions on OAuth and the basics of it? Sound good? So OAuth and Salesforce. A lot of us have been in Salesforce for a long time, and oftentimes in Salesforce, it's not quite the same thing as it is outside of Salesforce. So let's start with Salesforce supports both OAuth 1.0 and 2.0. They're not at all related to each other. One is not an upgrade from the other. OAuth 1.0 is exactly what it sounds like. It was the initial attempt for a framework, but it had a lot of gaps. And so instead of making that a second version having be related, when they built OAuth 2.0, they decided it would be a completely different framework. They're not backward compatible. It just does not work together. So even though it seems like they do, don't be confused by that. They're completely separate. OAuth in Salesforce is very limited compared to the actual protocol. So if you were to go on the OAuth pages that are available online, you would see that it's capable of doing a lot more things than what we're going to cover in this session or in these sessions. We're going to focus on what Salesforce allows you to do. And don't assume that if you've seen OAuth work in a particular way with another application like a Java application, it might be different in Salesforce. Specifically, there's a lot of things where a refresh token, and we'll talk about what that means eventually. A refresh token is pretty common to use on OAuth in a whole bunch of different OAuth flows, but in Salesforce, it's only allowed in 2 of the flows and not in the rest. And that's a great example of the difference. And just like you've seen in Apex or SQL, right? SQL is very similar to SQL, but it doesn't have all the same functions. And Apex is very similar to other object-oriented languages like Java or C++ or .NET, but it's still, you don't have all of the same capabilities in Apex than you do in those languages. So very much the same thing. When you think of OAuth in this certification, put your hat on. We're talking about Salesforce and what Salesforce allows. So let's talk about the components of OAuth. And we'll go into each one of these in more detail in the next few slides. But you want to keep in mind that the components of OAuth 2.0 are, you have different roles, endpoints, scopes and consent, and grant types. And each one of these are really important to understand, because depending on the flow that you're talking about, they're going to work a little bit differently and they're going to connect a little bit differently. Again, all of these will make sense at the end of 3 weeks because you'll know what each one of those are. So we'll go to the next page just to explain this a little bit more. So let's talk about roles. And I completely borrowed, stolen, whatever you want to call it, from Ladies Be Architect. I had the chance to meet Carly at TDX last week. She's amazing. She did these videos in 2018, and they're a great starting place. But again, keep in mind, things have changed a lot in 5 years. And so the roles that she had identified are resource owner, resource server, client, and authorization server. So let's go through each one individually. So a resource owner is usually going to be a human being, somebody that says, yes, here's my login credentials, and you have access to use that information. It could also be a system though. So whenever you see a resource owner, don't assume it's a human user, it could be a system. And they're the ones that have the credentials, they own those credentials, and they're the ones that are going to say, yes, you're able to use those resources on my behalf. The resource server, a great example is Salesforce. All the data that's stored in Salesforce and the capabilities are resource servers. Something else might be if you're using Google Mail inside another application, the features of Google Mail are the resource. Don't worry about credentials there. It's just all the functions. Those live on Google as the resource server for Gmail. Oftentimes, all of these resources are available via APIs because that's how you're going to be connecting between your client application and the resource server. So the client application, like we said earlier, it's going to be a website, a mobile app. It might be, Salesforce can be its own client application. If it's going into your ERP system as an example to get data, that would be a great way to see Salesforce as a client. A lot of Experience Cloud sites are clients because it's really a website, right? It's a UI trying to get and access data and information. That would be the resources. And then the authorization server is what determines, based on your OAuth flow and how you're authenticated, what they authorize you to have access to. And so the way to think about it is, when you come into my house, I know who you are, you knock on the door, I open the door, and now you're allowed in my house. Great. You've been authenticated because I know who you are. But now you ask me to use my Wi-Fi access. My Wi-Fi is my resources. And so when I send you the code from my phone, because I'm going to let you get out of my Wi-Fi, that is me saying, I know who you are, and you're able to use my Wi-Fi. So that's a good example to think about it outside of Salesforce and applications. It's still technology, but it's a great example to say, you're able to use my pool, right? It doesn't have to be technology. Bring your suit, you're going to be able to jump in the pool. So that's a way of saying my house has those resources, you've been allowed into it, and what can you do in it? So I'm going to pause because that's a lot of information. Questions or comments, or do you have any other examples that you'd want to share?
So for any OAuth, all these will be required, right? It will go through the resource owner, then the resource server, then the client, yes, and the authorization server.
Yes, and that's a great point. I added a fifth one here called the device, because the device one isn't optional. And to your point, Sita, yes, these four are always involved when you're using OAuth, because you have to have somebody that has credentials that authorizes it. You have to have an application that's using the client, that's using the resources, you're granting the resources, and you're being authorized. So all of these are required. Great question. In a device like your TV, your thermostat, or any number of other Internet of Things items. Technically in my toothbrush, I think I can connect to the internet, which I think is really funny. That would be a device. Usually, like my toothbrush, has a very limited UI. And again, this is a great example from the video. These are all required, but you do have one more that it was around in 2018, but not quite as prevalent as it is now, the device flow. Other questions?
The limited UI, why did you refer the limited UI? Is it because there's nothing much you interact on the UI? Is that the reason why you put a limited UI?
Yeah, what would happen here is, so my toothbrush, if I want to connect my toothbrush to start collecting data on how good I am about brushing my teeth and am I getting all the 4 quadrants right, I have to go to a mobile app. I have to download an app, I have to connect it to my toothbrush, and then everything that I do to connect that toothbrush to the mobile app is done on the mobile device. And so, sorry, I shouldn't have used device. So on the mobile application, so your toothbrush is the device.
Okay.
The phone is your mobile app, which is your client, and that's where you have all the UI. But my toothbrush is pretty dumb, right? All it has is on/off button, and a couple other settings. But I can't put in a password or a username on it. I have to use something else to be able to authenticate and authorize it.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. And TVs used to be pretty darn dumb. They used to not have a whole lot of UIs or keyboards or anything like that. And I know I have a plug that I can connect to the internet so I can turn it on and off when I'm away from home. The plug doesn't have an interface at all. I have to go on my mobile app to turn it on. Same thing for my thermostat. My thermostat actually has a decent screen that I can enter things in, but the very first ones did not have that at all. Like I see refrigerators now with whole screen. I'm like, wow, whole computers in the door. But those do have UIs. All right, let's go to the next screen. So endpoints. Endpoints, there's actually only two. So you have an access, you have an authorized endpoint and a token endpoint. And like you were asking before, Sita, what you want to look at is those 4 roles that are required. Your client application is going to request a resource. When that resource is requested, the authentication server is going to say, is this person authenticated? And if they're not, I'm going to go through the flow of getting them authenticated and authorized, which you always start at the authorization endpoint. Once you have this done, you get a authorization code. And that authorization code, which is an authorization grant that she has here, can be exchanged for an access token. And you do that at the token endpoint. So everything that's going on here and all the traffic, you just want to remember that there are 2 endpoints, one for authorizing and one for the token. And there's a whole bunch of tokens that get created. The main ones are your access token and your refresh token. And there's some exchanges that happen here. So questions about endpoints, and we'll talk about tokens a little bit more in the next few slides. But these are your 2 endpoints. Remember those, they're very important. As you remember with my domain name, your domain name should be specific to your company, not use the node, because then you're hard coding the URL. And it's better to not use the login.salesforce domain and just use yours instead. Use my domain name.
So I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
The authorization endpoint and token endpoint, they could be one and the same also, right? Or must it always be different?
I've always seen them to be different. So your authorization server and your resource server might be the same server, but your endpoints are, I've always seen them to be separate, but that might be just my experience. For Salesforce, they're always separate. So when you're connecting to Salesforce to get authorized and then get a token, they're always going to be different.
Okay. And token is always required for us to have any kind of API calls, right? I mean, that is the main.
There is one OAuth flow that does not require a token, and that is if you're using single sign-on and you have a SAML assertion. So if you log into your Salesforce CRM system and you've been authenticated because you're logged in or you have SSO, then you go to a resource server and you say, hey, this person is already authenticated. Here's their SAML assertion. The authorization server can use that instead of creating an authorization code or an access token, and it just gives them access. That's the only time it's not required. Every other time and every other flow that we're going to go through in a week or two does require a token, and there's different flavors of tokens. And almost always it is an access token.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's SAML assertion does not require a token. Everything else does. So when it comes to studying for the certification, if you learn the one, you know that everything else doesn't matter. Because I think there's like I think my spreadsheet right now has 12 lines. So there's 11 flows. One of them is not a token and everything else is a token.
Okay, and assertion is different from a token, correct? Assertion will have a time component, token does not have a time component.
They both have time components, just based on different things. So the SAML assertion is based on your logged in session into your CRM system. And so whatever your policies are there, right? If it expires in 2 hours, so will your SAML assertion. A token will depend on how you set up your connected app. If it's going to your access token, you can have it expire in minutes or hours. The refresh token is the one that tends to be very long-lived, usually hours or days, oftentimes until revoked, which means it doesn't expire until you remove it. So the refresh token is the one that has a very long life, but the access token is usually hours, minutes or hours.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because what's going to happen is when you get an access token that expires in usually 2 hours, because that's your login session, if your flow provided a refresh token for you, you can use that refresh token that doesn't expire for a long time to get another access token, because that way you're not harassing the user to be logging in every 2 hours. You can just do it for them on their behalf. If you don't have a refresh token, you've got to start all over again. And so all of these end up being very intertwined in how you use them.
So in single sign-on, I mean, that is the user experience difference, right? In single sign-on,
Yes.
no matter what, you will have to log in. There is no refresh mechanism, automatic refresh mechanism.
Correct. And that's where
Okay.
the SAML assertion is the one that expires per your policies, whether it's an hour, usually it's 2 hours, right? It tends to be standard. That one, like you said, you have to re-log in because your session expired.
Okay. So that's why OAuth is kind of preferable if you want that kind of user experience.
It is, and it's also preferable because with OAuth, you never give your username and password to your client application. What your client application gets, it's some coded token that says, great, Marlene has permission to use this application, just give me that token, and I never give them a username and password, because if I give them my password, then they can use it for other things, right? I recently had my Amazon password got hacked. And so luckily I don't use the same password on different applications. So I caught it and I turned on MFA on my Amazon account and I changed my password, right? And I was talking to my husband. Even though it was complex, it can still be dictionary. Like you can go through it. It was 2 words that were together with some numbers and some characters, and it got guessed. So it just happens, right? But because it wasn't used anywhere else, I got lucky and it didn't have any negative effects on me. But again, if I don't want to give my Amazon password to applications because I don't know what they're going to do with them, I prefer to use the token whenever I can, even as a user.
Thank you.
All right, so talk about tokens, a lot of text. And this is what we're talking about right now. The token is the communication between the client, the authorization server, and the authentication, right? All of these roles are going to be playing together. Depending on how they communicate to each other, they're going to give you different tokens. Almost always when you're using the authorization code flow, you start by getting an authorization code. And I'm sorry, I'll change it because it should be code, not token. You get an authorization code. And this one serves to say, yes, this person entered the correct credentials. You have this very short-lived, and I've not been able to find out what short-lived means, by the way, but I think it's minutes. I don't think it's 15 minutes. I think it's something shorter, where it says, this person entered the right credentials. You can convert this authorization code into an access token. And so this one is minutes. An access token gets exchanged. And this one, like we were saying, can live per your session settings in your org or in your server. And it usually includes what permissions that person gave. So for Workbench, if I give access to the data in Salesforce, it comes back as it does. If I deny that, then I was authenticated, but I provided an access token with no permission, so they can't do anything with it. So the application is just going to fail. But the access token includes the user that has the access, the time that that access token was generated, and the scopes that you are granted. So that's all part of the access token. In some flows, you get the refresh token, like I have here. Salesforce limits this, and so you want to make sure that when we go into that, you understand that, because that will definitely be part of the certification. And it's also very useful when you're connecting with your APIs and your client applications to know, hey, for this one, I have to do something different because I used a flow that doesn't give me a refresh token. The refresh token, just like we said, usually lives for days, if not forever. And if you have it never expire, there are ways to revoke it. So you can go on Salesforce, find what tokens have been granted, and revoke them. That way, it's not something you can forever do. As an example, for my Amazon password that got hacked, when I refreshed my password, or I updated my password, it gave me the option of logging me out of the current device or all devices that I'm logged into. You can guess that I did all of them because I wanted to make sure that nothing had that password. It was old, it was compromised, and I'm okay connecting all of my devices. Like I have Prime on multiple TVs. It's completely fine for me to get that redone. So that really revoked any refresh tokens that those devices had. And then this refresh token is used to it can be used in two ways. If you have an active access token and you want to have multiple access tokens at the same time, you can create concurrent access token with your refresh token. Or when your access token expires because it met that life of your session, you can use the refresh token to generate a new one. And so, like, again, going back to my Prime Amazon experience, I provided my password again to my TV. My TV's been off for hours now because I've been working. And so when if I watch TV tonight and I go to my Amazon Prime account, it's going to use that refresh token to reauthorize Prime to show me my videos. And so the original access token will have expired because that's a couple of hours, but with the refresh token, it will reconnect and let me access it, which is kind of nice. So these are the main tokens we need to understand and have a really good grasp on. What questions do you guys have?
So for whether it's a device or anything, all these tokens will work, right? Authorization code, access token, and refresh token.
They're a little bit different. I don't want to say yes because devices have a different type of token. These three tokens are going to be more common for a mobile application, a website, or a desktop application. So anything that has a more robust UI, these are going to be your best ways to connect your systems. There are other types of tokens that you might be using. So this doesn't apply to all of them, but it applies to most of them.
Okay, just a small question.
Mm-hmm.
You do a security token for your password, right? From the UI. Is that also through OAuth?
Yes. And so
Okay.
there's nothing in OAuth that's called a security token. But if you're doing a security check, and like when I go to Amazon, like I said, to connect my TV, I can, it has me go to my mobile app to say, yes, I can connect this device. I don't have to even retype my username and password on my mobile app because it already knows it. And it's not a security token. That's using the access token and the refresh token. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about what are called grant types. And so depending on your grant type is what defines the kind of tokens that you use. There's one grant type called authentication code. That grant type always uses these tokens. And again, refresh token is only for some of the flows.
Okay, you got it right. For your password, you can create a security token, and
Yes.
yeah, okay, got it.
Yep.
Thanks.
And there's a couple more tokens we're going to talk about. They're less common, but we're going to walk through them anyway right now because again, we're building a cake and we're building layers. And so there's one called ID token. And so in the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about when you set up your client application in Salesforce. For every client application, you set up a connected app. And when you set up a connected app, you say, here's the possible permissions that connected app can use. Those are called scopes. One of those scopes is the one that gives you back the ID token. And the ID token is going to be information about the user. It might be the user's name, email, IP, their ID, and those kind of things. Like if you ever log in using LinkedIn to one of the other systems, it will tell you, do you want to share your name with the system? And what it's asking you there is, what information can I include in the ID token? That ID token also contains information about the application that's being connected. And this is going to be provided if we have what's called the OpenID Connect scope. All of this is returned in a JSON web token, JWT. And so the ID token is basically, do you want your client to get that person's name, email, and other information? You would request the ID token. Then you have an actor token. The actor token and the asset token go together. We'll talk about the asset token in detail in probably 2 weeks. But let's say that I bought a server, and that server comes with a warranty, and I want to be able to connect it with Dell and those kind of things. When I register my device through some application that I have to do that with, I would put in the serial number for my device. If that's connected to Salesforce, Dell uses Salesforce, by the way. And so you go in there, it's going to create me as the customer as an actor token, because that has information that's about me. And eventually it's going to create an asset token. So that server that I purchased has a serial number, it has my information, and it puts it all together in Salesforce with the customer information, the asset information, and it creates these pieces together. So this is a very specific flow for Salesforce because they want you to be able to manage your assets in Salesforce. But actor token and asset token go together. Those are all the tokens we're going to talk about today. The other ones are even more specific than these two, and we'll get to them when we're talking about the individual flows. So before I go on to PKCE, any questions on the tokens? All right. It's been a couple of months, but one of my LinkedIn contacts put in a message on LinkedIn saying, where is everything going? Are we dignifying everything? Because somebody asked me for a PKCE token in my OAuth authentication. And he just was not familiar with, which I was not either at the time, with PKCE, pronounced PKCE. This has been added to that grant type that I was talking about earlier. Authorization code grant type is one of the most common ones that get used for OAuth. And what they found is a client would request the authorization code, and then they take that and they exchange it for the access token, because that is what really gives you access to all your resources. They were finding that sometimes the requester was not the one that was exchanging it. And so that was creating security gaps because somebody could steal your authorization code in the middle and take your access token and then have access over your application. I know about a month or so ago, my security team asked us to log out of all of our Jira instances because there was a security issue. And they said that there was a possibility that this could happen, that they could steal the information in the middle and take over your information. So what has come about in the past couple of years is they've added this thing called PKCE. It stands for Proof Key Code Exchange. And so what they're saying is what happens is the client is going to create an encrypted piece of information that gets sent when they first request the authorization code. So let's say, I'm going to make it a little bit easier, right? I'm going to send in my encrypted last 4 digits of my social security number with my request to when I'm logging in. And it's encrypted, and I send that to the authorization server, and they get it, and they say, great, we have your code, we have how to decrypt it, because that's already been set up in the past, right? There's some certificate that you've set up, and they send back the authorization code. Next step is the client then wants to exchange that code. What they do is they add a different version of the code challenge. It's called a code verifier. And that code verifier, the the authorization server can say, yes, that code challenge was the encrypted version of the code verifier. So I can say that the person that requested it is the same one that is exchanging it. And so this is a way to make sure that the same client application is the one that's actually getting access to your resources. It is heavily recommended that if you're using the authorization code flow or grant type for OAuth, that you implement PKCE. It's very easy to do. You load up your certificate to your Salesforce connected app. That comes from your client, because that's how you're gonna know how to decrypt it. And then you know that it's always, the handshake is solid. There's nothing in the middle that can steal it. So this is a great security enhancement. Questions on this one?
So when will we use this? I mean, when would I prefer PKCE over, say, I don't know, some other grant type? When?
So the grant types that you have, and right now I'm only remembering a couple on the top of my head because we'll go through that in a little bit, but you have authorization code, you have implicit, you have client credentials, and username and password, I think is the four. User password is the least secure because you're actually giving people your credentials directly. Client credentials can be like your client ID and your consumer secret, which is a little bit better because at least it's separated from your user. And those two are still not really as secure as it could be. Implicit is going to be using the SAML assertion we talked about earlier, so we'll skip implicit for now. But anytime you're using authorization code, it's not required to use PKCE as an addition on it. You kind of layer it on top. Almost most applications out there are using the authorization code grant type. It's the most common one. And one of the things that you'll see is even though Salesforce talks about 12 different flows, it's not actually 12 different flows. There's 4 or 5 that use the other authorization code. And once you start to group those together, it's easier to remember what goes together. But again, it's not required, but it's heavily encouraged for you to add PKCE on top of authorization code. The only thing that would be more secure than this would be if you're doing the JWT bearer token flow. That one's pretty darn secure, but that's also using certificates, and that's using encryption in the middle to make sure that things are properly authorized. So the answer is you should add it anytime you're doing authorization code.
Okay.
And I went really fast through this, so I'm going to take 2 steps back. So the standard or simplified authorization code flow is the client sends the request, the authorization code is sent by the authorization server, then the client asks for the access token, because remember you have two endpoints. One is the authorization endpoint for the code, and then one is the token endpoint for your access token. Then the authorization will reply back always with the access token, but with or without the refresh token. So this is the basic flow. That's the bouncing back and forth, the ball going back and forth between the client and the authorization server. Where you have the A here and the B is where you're adding PKCE. And like I said, what this is saying is the requester sends the encrypted code challenge. The authorization is going to decrypt it, understand what it was, and then they get back the code verifier with the authorization code and saying, oh yeah, I gave that person that authorization code so I can proceed. If the authorization code does not match the expected code verifier value, the authorization server is going to reply back with a failure saying you don't have the proper information, please try again. So that's that flow. All right, let's keep going.
If it is not verified also, the refresh token is generated?
No,
okay.
No, if the code verifier does not match the expected value, it fails and it does not grant the access token.
Okay.
Yep. And I gave you, again, Cloud Sundial. Yep. And I'll post these slides like usual. You'll be able to click on the link. This goes exactly through what we just talked about, but step by step by step versus just a simplified flow. And again, this authorization code is really important to understand, and it's best practice not to include PKCE, but and when you think of browser, think of the client, right? It can be the mobile app, desktop, or website, and it's doing the dance here back and forth to eventually get access to the APIs. Oops, wrong way. So let's talk about scopes and consents. So we've covered a lot of content today, and as you can see, that original word cloud that I shared, we've only covered like 10 of those terms. And so some of the next slides, I'm going to go really high level because we're going to go into them much deeper in the next few sessions. So scopes and consent. And so we use the example of Workbench. When you log into Workbench, the very first time you say, yes, you're able to use the data from my org. And then after that, it just lets you re-log in. The same thing happens when you go with some of the social applications. And Carly here had 2 examples of using Facebook or Twitter. And so here it's telling you what the application is going to be able to access and what it's not going to be able to do. And these are scopes. And so this is the data and the data types that they'll be able to access. You can see your data, you can update your profile, and they can even post tweets for you, which means it's really acting on behalf of you. But it does not have access to some of your other data that says, no, they're not going to be able to see any direct messages. They can't see your Twitter password, because that's really the whole point of OAuth. We don't want to give people our passwords, which is why you would use OAuth, and they can't see their email. This is just one example of how the application and the resource server communicated and said, here's where you're allowed to use and here's where you can't use. It's just an example of scopes and consent. Have you guys seen examples of this when you log into all of your different applications? No worries. We'll go on to the next slide.
So all this
Yep.
scope is entered into this scope to allow and scope to deny is entered at the connected app, is it? In the
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. And if we have time, I'll open up one of my dev orgs and we'll look at a connected app just so you can start to see where the pieces go. Let's look at grant types. And we started talking about this earlier. And again, I'm going to go through this really fast today because when we're looking at each flow, it's going to start to make more sense. So Carly created a summary slide of, at the top, you can see the grant types. And so here's the authorization code that we've been talking about. Then there's an assertion framework where we have the JW token, the SAML bearer assertion, and the SAML assertion. These are very different, so don't combine them in your mind. Then we have implicit. Then we have resource, owner, password credentials, and then client credentials. And so these are your grant types. And this is, I'm trying to remember, I don't think there are some new grant types. And so when we start talking about the grant types, we're going to add some more columns to this document because I love the way that Carly formatted everything. And then here she's got the name of the OAuth flows. And this is where I go back to, I was studying for my certification, thinking this is everything that I had to learn, but there's got 5 more rows. So keep in mind, great video, but we want to make sure we cover all of the ones that are in the help docs. She summarizes each one of them here. We're not going to do this today, but here she shows what in Salesforce allows to use a refresh token. And some of these are never issued and some of these are issued. And again, we'll look at these individually, and then she goes through the drawbacks. When you're getting ready for your certification, you want to understand the drawbacks because they'll be asking you questions about, in this scenario, your options are A or B, which one do you recommend as an architect? You want to understand what they're asking you for to make sure that you pass your certification. So again, this is a great summary. We've added a lot more content since 2018. We're going to build our own document here. And by the end of these sessions, you'll be able to use it as a reference document. And again, the PKCE can be added to the authorization code flow. It cannot be added to any of the other grant types. Oops, wrong way. So let's look at examples. So this is one example that I have. My Pandora account wanted me to, I was traveling last week and Pandora wanted me to enter my email and password on a hotel TV. Probably okay, but I don't know. And it's Pandora. Like, is it really a big deal for me to put my email and password here? Not really, but I still didn't do it because the remote on the TV was not responding really well. So I did not want to go through it and hit OK like 10 times to just put in the first letter of my username and password. So I just didn't use Pandora when I was traveling. This is going to be the least secure, least desirable flow to use because you're putting in your actual username and password for you to get access to the resources you're requesting. So before I go into the next one, any questions on this one? Does this one make sense why it's the least secure? Because keep in mind, right, I'm entering this on a TV that I don't own. It's a Pandora application, and I just did not want to take the risk. And it's easy for Pandora, but if we're talking about your bank or any other financial information, you would never want to use this. You'd want to use a different method to get access to your information. The other example I have for you is Amazon. And this is where I showed that I can either go on the web to the domain name that they gave me, amazon.com/mytv. And as soon as I enter this 6-digit code, it knows what's going on. And we're actually going to dive into what this device flow means, because when I put up this screen, what happens is the TV starts to go check. Do I have permission yet? Do I have permission yet? And it keeps checking for a period of time until it either fails or accepts. Part of this flow, when you reply back, when Amazon got this 6-digit code, it said check every minute or whatever the time sequence is. The same thing happens if I use my QR code to scan it. This will actually enter the code for me automatically, which is pretty cool. This I was very comfortable using when I was in my hotel because I was not entering any information on the device. I was using it on my protected mobile device, and I felt much better about it. So this is an example of 2 OAuth flows, where one is using the user password credentials, and this one is actually, it's not really an access token, but we'll talk about what this actually is in a couple of weeks, but it's far more secure and it gives me greater comfort. Questions or comments?
How are you saying 2 OAuth?
I'm sorry?
How are you saying it's a 2 flow, right? 2 OAuth.
So let me go back. So, oops. So this is one
Yes,
OAuth
one.
flow, right? And then this one is the same device OAuth flow that it's using. It's always using that code. So this is the same one. It's just letting me access in 2 different ways. One is on my mobile app and one is via the web.
Okay, got it. This is an OTP which gets generated, right? This is the FZ.
Yeah, this code got generated as a one-time code for me, right? That's why I have it here, because you can't reuse it. And I can add it to my TV fine. It gets generated by whatever system Amazon is using. I know Amazon is a huge user of Salesforce, but I don't know that they're using Salesforce for any of their Prime functionality. But yeah. Yeah. And then I wanted to show Pandora also has the device activation where I can go to my mobile app instead of the web. And then it took me actually like 5 clicks to find it. And once I found it, then I can enter the code, and then Pandora knows that I can log in. And here they also let me log in with my email. And again, I did not want to do that. So it's good when you're thinking of building applications or when you're asked to do something like this to know what will improve security both for your application, but also the comfort of your users. So now let's talk about, we have about 10 minutes left. Do you guys want to do a quiz, or do you guys want to go look at a connected app?
Quiz maybe.
All right, let's do a quiz. And so I will put it on our chat. As soon as I find our chat, there's our chat. And I may need to change something on it. All right. And I ended up creating something like 56 questions for all of the OAuth pieces. For today, I only have like 10 or 15 questions, and then we'll figure out how we're doing. So I have not looked at these since I wrote them like 3 weeks ago. so we can all learn together. Right. Start the quiz. Now, 51 questions, sorry, but we'll only have a few. So what is a valid client for OAuth? Select 3 answers. And so your clients are going to be your desktop, mobile app, website, device, or Internet of Things. Your API server is your resource server, and it's not considered a client. So in your roles, when you're thinking about them, your client is usually what a user is using. Question 2. What are OAuth roles? Select 5. Twenty seconds. And so your roles are going to be your resource owner, which is usually an end user or a system, your client, your mobile app, your website, your authorization server, which is the one that grants you access to it, and then your resource server, which is going to be usually your APIs that you can use. And the device is the 5th one that we added since Carly had her slides. Because you get your tokens as part of when you're authorized, but it's not a role in the system. Question 3. Match the terms. So this one you guys get to select in the dropdown what it says. Match terms for PKCE. And so your code verifier is that random string that is first generated by the client. Then you have your code challenge, which is basically the decrypted version of your code verifier. And then you tell it where it's going to be either plain because you're not encrypting it or you're encrypting it. And I got it wrong as well, by the way. I don't know who got it right, but good job. Go to the next question. What is true about authorization code grant? Select 4 answers. Twenty seconds. So it's a grant type. It's the primary grant type that you're most likely to use. It's very short-lived. At some point, I would love to know how long that is, but it's minutes. It's definitely not hours. It's requested by the client because that's where they're going to exchange for their access token, and it's generated by the authorization server. And the reason this one is wrong is because you use your refresh token to get a new access token after it has expired. And again, it's short-lived, not long-lived, and it's generated by the authorization server, not the client. But this one was a tricky one because you need to know the difference between a refresh token, an access token, and an authorization code. All right, we have time for a couple more. What is the flow for using PKCE? And they're all about 20 seconds left. Submit what you have. And so the first thing that happens is the client is going to generate that code verifier and the code challenge because they want to encrypt that. They send that request for the assertion code with that code verifier. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Then the code is generated and sent back to the client. And then here is where you confirm the handshake because the client is going to send back the same authorization code and the original code verifier to request a token. The authorization server validates the information, and if it passes, then it sends the access token. If it does not pass, then it sends back a failure. I'm not sure that the flow itself is important, but I think what's important is that you know that the client has generated an encrypted piece of information along with how it got encrypted, and then the authorization server is going to accept that and then decrypt it and validate it in the end. So just make sure you understand that PKCE has to do with that confirming the handshake. I have time for one more. It's question 6. What are the 4 grant types? Select 4 questions for answers. About 30 seconds. And so your grant types are going to be your authorization code. Everybody get it right because I keep saying it's the most important one. Then you have implicit, which is going to be your SAML assertion because you're accepting that they're already authenticated. Then you have the resource owner password credentials, which is the least desirable because it's the least secure. And the client credentials, which has your mobile or web app, has additional information that they send in with the flow. Your tokens are not grant types. They are provided as part of one of the grant types that you request. It's 7 o'clock. Let's see if we can look at the leaderboard so you guys know. how we did. And so I always think it's funny, I can call people when they're here. Thank you so much for joining today's session. I will load the slides, I will load the video, and then I had planned 15 questions for today's session, so I'll load that too as well. And then if you're able to join on Sunday, we'll complete the questions, and if not, we're good. Starting next week, we're only going to meet once a week. And so next week, I've already posted the next OAuth session. Thank you, Fernando. And you can sign up for the next 2 ones if you'd like. But moving forward, beyond the Sunday, we're going to meet once a week instead of twice. And then I'll just publish the quizzes on Tuesdays or Wednesdays as we move forward. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I really appreciate your questions and your input. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, Marlene.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Thank you.
you've completed your exam?
I have not. So I had technical difficulties when
Oh.
I went to